Hey guys, welcome back to SB Racing Garage. As promised, we are going to go over power plant that's going to be going in the old Challenger. Kind of what we did with it. I'll go through all the build specs. I won't hold anything back. If you have any questions at all, throw them in the comments. Any tips? We'll show you what we ended up with for power and torque, and maybe you guys can give some advice of how to make that next number. After that, we're going to go into just mocking up the transmission, starter, things like that, just because of we're going with something a little different. And I have definitely learned that it is better to mock it up outside of the car than inside of the car. It can be a bit of a pain in the butt sometimes when you do it that way. So, without further ado, we'll go into this to start. So, it is the block that, if you remember from Dan's uh, channel, he had kind of gave it a dingle ball hone. He threw in some new pistons and kind of rebuilt it. It honestly, it ran pretty good for what it was. It's a 30-year-old race engine that had been sitting for God knows how long, and we went through it. Through We had a few issues with it. One of them, we broke the rocker shaft, and it just kept piling up. And I decided, when we decided to do this drag week thing, we needed a new motor, something that would be reliable, something that we could push a little harder, and also hopefully will live on the street. So that's where we came up with this. So it is a 440 block, the RB block. 71 HP would be the on the ID tag on the front. Other than that, there's nothing left that's Chrysler, I don't think. So what we ended up originally, it was just going to be a 440. It was going to get bored over a little bit more. It was 30 over when I got it, like when Dan had it, just because of some of a little bit of the scuffing and some of the rust that was still left in the cylinders. We decided to go to 55 over, so it is now a 4375 bore. Initially, we're just going to say stock stroke. Ended up being that the cranking would need to be ground. It was already ground 10 under, so we would have to go 20 under. That limited a bunch of bearing choices, which my engine builder, who was Ken Murray, you might know that name from Ken's Custom Auto, plastered all over Schroeder's car, but very well known engine builder and kind of a huge name in this area. So he didn't really like that because the bearing choices start to get kind of limited at 20 when it's ground 20 under. So the decision was made to buy a new crank. If you're going to buy a new crank, it's the same cost whether you buy a 3750 stroke, which is the stock stroke, or 4150 or 4250. We ended up doing is we got an Eagle crank, which is a 4150 stroke. Eagle cranks are great. We'll go with the issue that we had with ours as Molnar rods with a 990 pin, which is a big block Chevy, as opposed to the Chrysler, which is a 1094. Just lightens up the rotating mass a little bit. Ross flat top pistons, Trick Flow 270 max wedge heads, which wound up being great heads. Honestly, if you're building a full-on race motor, probably not the heads for you, but they're a great kind of street strip. I should have probably went with something even maybe a little bigger, try to squeeze a little more power out of it, but they definitely exceeded our expectations. We got their brand new Trick Flow R Series intake, has the Dominator flange. We are running a Dominator carb. It's an 1100 CFM built by Pro Systems. 1.6 Harlan Sharp rolling rockers, a Bullet solid roller cam. That is 271, 275 at 50 on a 108 lobe separation, and we installed that at 104. With the 1.6 rockers, it's about 686 lift. External oiling, Milodon billet pump. We'll explain the issue we had with that on the dyno. We got an motor plates from AR Engineering. We did the external oiling filter, MSD distributor, and we went with crank trigger ignition, which honestly, anybody, if you ever, you're thinking about whether it's worth it or anything like that, power gains, obviously there's not really any, as opposed to a distributor. But as far as timing control, this ultimately made its best power at 32 degrees, and it didn't matter if you were idling at 1100 or 1000 or 7000 RPM. That when you put the timing light on it, it was rock steady. And if any of building kind of the bigger, higher horsepower engines, sometimes you get into like the distributor. Sometimes they can swing 4 or 5 degrees just with the flex and everything going on at that kind of RPM. On the dyno, we ran into a bit of an issue. This is the oil pump drive shaft. It's not supposed to have a second piece to it. What ended up happening is the clearance in the Mylodon pump was a little too tight to the cover. So when the cover was bolted on, there was only about a thou clearance between the cover and the inside of the pump itself, the gear. What happened is this thing wound up turning some RPM, and ultimately on our third dyno pull, which we pulled it all the way to 7,000, it snapped the oil pump drive. Took it apart. I called my engine builder, said like, what could cause this? Said he's actually never seen the Mylodon shaft break like that. So once we kind of measured everything, we determined that it probably what the pump was and the cover were a little too tight a clearance. So just when you're building an engine like this, my recommendation is measure and clean everything. Like even when you think it's not something that, something like that, honestly, that was my mistake. I just bolted it on. I thought it would be okay. They're two parts that are made for each other. They manufacture them together. You still got to measure. I learned that the hard way. Ended up costing me an oil pump drive shaft. Could have been a lot worse because, when we started it up, thankfully it happened at the very end of the run and it was shut down immediately. When we fired it up for the fourth run and saw zero oil pressure, shut it right down after about 2 seconds. We figured out the problem, fixed it, ran it again, changed oil, cut the oil filter, nothing in the oil filter, nothing in the, so looks like we came out unscathed. So ultimately, it ended up making 781 horsepower at 6,500 RPM and 723 foot-pounds of torque at 5,000 RPM. I'll post up a picture of the dyno sheet right now, and you'll see from between like 5,900 and I think 7,000, it made over 770 horsepower. So it's got a real flat torque curve, which basically comes down to the heads. The heads are ultimately they're small block Chevy heads, real good small block Chevy heads. Mopar guys, like, it's fun to build them, but you're a step behind the big block Chevys, and it's just because of cylinder head. Great engines, I love them. I love this engine, but face it, if you wanted to really amp it up, it's easier with the Chevy. But up for the challenge, and now the goal is how do you get that extra 19 horse to push it up to the 800 mark? Because I can't say it's 800 horsepower yet, unfortunately. Without further ado, we'll dig into this a little bit. We are going to mate up the transmission and get that all mocked up, like I said in the beginning. Transmission we're going with, Turbo 400. 727s, they're amazing transmissions. They're great transmissions for what they are. The cost to build one in comparison to a Turbo 400 that would handle power like this is astronomical. And there were a couple other reasons that I went with the Turbo 400, which we'll go over next. All right, here we are. Here's the transmission. It is a Turbo 400. It's got a reed bell, reed case. That is pretty much the number one reason I went with a Turbo 400. There are no aftermarket SFI cases for the 727. Once you get over that 10-second range and underneath the 10-second range, hoping this runs in like the 940s, 950s, you need either a trans blanket or an SFI case on the transmission. I didn't want to run a trans blanket. Doing the drag and drive stuff, the biggest issue and the biggest killer of transmissions is definitely going to be heat. And a trans blanket, it just holds in heat. It makes it hard to work on. You always got to fight with that thing anytime you need to do maintenance or anything like that. So we went with Turbo 400. Also, on top of that, if you ever need parts or anything goes wrong, I mean, say a drag week, Rocky Mountain Race week, sick week, 80% of the people there are running Turbo 400s. If you need a part, you're going to be able to find a part generally. So that was a huge decision maker as well. Filled with, all kinds of good stuff. Real good clutches, Sonex input shafts. Engine or the transmission builder says you can push 1500 through it, no problem, without a hiccup. The change of, I want to say it's the intermediate shaft, I'm no expert transmission guy, and this thing could handle 2000 horsepower. I'm not going to be anywhere near that, but it kind of just gives you the confidence to be able to basically run anything you want through it, and you're not going to have any kind of issues. It does have as you can see, it does have a trans brake. We got the AN fittings for the cooler lines. Other than that, it's your pretty basic, simple 400, other than a real expensive case and bell housing. Nice thing about the bell housing is, it's just bolted onto the pump. So if you ever need to change it over, you want to switch it and you're going back to a GM or you're going to any other motors, they make bell housings to basically fit anything you wanted. So that gives you a ton of options, and this transmission, as expensive as it was, should last a long time. All right, so when you're mounting up a Turbo 400 to a big block Chrysler, or really any Chrysler for that matter, first what you need is this spacer. This is basically going to allow the ring gear to be spaced out so that you can basically run any Turbo 400 converter. You can run anything from your wildest billet converter to a bone stock one if you wanted. Essentially, you don't need anything special in the converter that way. There's no, needing a longer pilot or anything like that. It just bolts right up. Secondly, a 130 tooth flex plate. It's also from ATI. It's SFI rated, so we're good there. Make everything legal and be able to pass tech. And it basically just bolts together just as simply as the stock one does. First, you'll put on your spacer the right way, which registers on the crank, like so. Try to get your both holes lined up. Then we'll take your flex plate, also get it on, and try to get it so it lines up with the bolt. We are not, because I'm a bonehead. Chryslers have the offset bolts. You can see it's not fully concentric. You have the two that are, over here, two that are closer together. So it might help if we line it up the proper way. Oh, and get everything kind of lined up. Now for bolts, we have these ARP Flexplate bolts. They are 1¼ inch long. They're also from ATI, made specifically for this. Is obviously you need longer bolts. I wanted to go with the extreme duty ones. Is you're going to be running a little bit of power through this, and you just don't want to have any kind of issues, especially when it comes to Flexplate bolts. Now, I like to just run them down by hand. We're just simply mocking this up right now, so we're not using any Loctite or Moly. And speaking of that, let me know what you guys use typically. You use red Loctite on these. You use ARP Moly Lube, being that they're Moly bolts. Have you ever had experience with them coming loose? I think personally I'll probably go with the red Loctite, but we'll see what you guys have done. Somehow this is moved. Who knew this would be a struggle bus, just trying to get these two things lined up. Let's try this again. I don't know what I am doing or what I'm thinking, but okay, we're good and lined up there. Now, for whatever reason, I figured it out. So, when you're putting this on, this is a really important step. Now, I'm not big on reading instructions or anything like that, but when your plate says engine side, you should probably put that towards the engine. Maybe things would line up just that much better. And would you look at that? It happens to. And I have to apologize again. I have been battling a cold. And I probably sound so nasally. But, as you know, you still got to get things done. I like to thread everything in by hand. Just that way you kind of know all the threads are good. Goes in smooth. You don't have to worry about stripping anything. And then we will just give them each a couple ooga doogas. Like I said, we're just fitting this on, mocking it up, just to make sure how it goes all together. So there we go. We got our ring gear on, and we'll mate it up to the transmission, and we'll get our starter, and we'll see how the starter lines up, whether it needs to be shimmed, out or anything like that. I don't know. You never know. What I've found out is when you're using a whole bunch of different aftermarket parts, don't always like to work together. So sometimes you got to do a little ingenuity, a little bit of machine work. All right, so as you can see, got the transmission mocked up to the engine. Fit great. Everything lined up well. Bang on with the dowels, and we used ARP bolts, which, I mean, it's a little added expense, but they are a dream to work with and good and strong. So next up, we need to fit the starter in. Now, we ran into one kind of issue. Here is the starter that came off it. It's your basic, typical mini starter for a Chrysler. It's got the nose piece. I think this is from Performance World, which is like a Canadian aftermarket company. And I'll show you the kind of issue we had, and I'll explain it. So there is as far as the seat. I don't know if you can see it in the camera, but there is about an 1/8 inch gap in between, maybe even bigger, in between the mounting bosses on the transmission and the starter itself. Reason being is Reed actually machines the hole for this nose piece to sit in, but machines it farther forward. Reason being is most guys, or a lot of guys, are using mid plates. I won't be using a mid plate. I'm using an engine mount or engine plate with side mounts. Reason I still use side mounts is to control that lateral motion on the engine. Engine plate kind of controls that side to side, takes the stress off the sides of the block, but the engine mounts will keep it from going front and back. You can remove the engine mounts, and there's other ways to run, you know, uh, lateral, they kind of run almost like torsion bars where it kind of limits that lateral movement. But this stops side to side. These will stop the lateral movement, and we'll have a poly bushing on the transmission just to have a little bit of flex there so it's not putting undue stress on the case. Anyway, that being said, we went with, or I got, a starter without a nose piece. I've read mixed reviews on this. Some say, oh, you have to have the nose piece, it increases strength, and whatever else. I know a lot of guys run these, especially in high horsepower cars. It's 12-to-1 compression. There's a lot of cranking pressure there, but I think it'll be okay. GMs don't have noses, and they seem to do just fine. The big one will be whether it lines up with the flex plate, will we need to shim it, anything like that, and will it just fit against the block. So we'll attempt to get her fitted on right now. Now there's two different lengths of starter bolts. I don't remember which goes on top and which goes on the bottom. So we are going to put the long one on the top and the short one on the bottom for now. Let me know in the comments. You tell me which way one goes, because I will take any kind of advice you guys can give. So we'll get that seated in there. Get the bolt started. Get the bolt started. Apparently it doesn't want to start. Man, talk about being on the struggle bus. I think the camera's throwing me off here, making me nervous. I'm also trying not to block the view of the camera. There we go. We'll just get this cranked down. Hopefully you can kind of see and you're not just getting a good view of my back. Alright, so there's that one started. And as you can see, the starter fits great. Now, what the clearance will be between the ring gear and the starter gear, I'll kind of wait to be determined. Might test it out while it's just sitting here. sure we can just hook a battery up to it and see how it sounds. Maybe pull a plug so there's not so much compression. Try to not completely knock this off. Man, these bolts are fighting me getting started. We'll pause it here and come back once it's all bolted together. All right, so there we go. We got the starter all bolted up. Went pretty well without issue. It was a pain in the butt to get the bolt started, and I don't know why. I think that's just late night my incompetence. But looking underneath, and it's kind of hard to crawl you under there right now. But it looks like the... Hey, you know what? We're going to try to get you under there. Hold on 1 second. I lied to you. You can't see under there. I don't have a light, nor can I fit under there and hold the phone or the camera all at the same time. But she's together. Next step will be getting it into the car. So the next video, we are going to try to muscle this all into the car. We're going to see kind of what needs to be done to the trans tunnel, how we're going to mount up rear transmission mount, what kind of cross member are we going to use. Are we going to use a Mopar one? Maybe there's ones for a different swap that we can kind of try to make work. I've got some ideas. I've got some parts here in stock that we'll give it a shot and see if we can make it work. Get the engine plate mounted up, and before we do any of that, the start of the episode, we'll see if we can get the headers to fit. See if they fit the starter. See if the starter turns the engine over. Whether it grinds, whether it needs to be shimmed or anything like that. Leaving the torque converter out, like I explained before, or I don't know if I explained or not, but basically the torque converter is going to be the last thing that goes in the car. You have to take everything into consideration: the gear ratio, your tire heights, the weight of the car. I don't know what the weight's going to be. Class I'm building it for has a 3,200 pound weight limit with the driver. So if I can get a Challenger down to 3,000 pounds, that I don't know, and it needs an upholstered interior, and the only fiberglass parts you're allowed are bumpers and hood. So we'll see. We'll see if we can get creative and what we can do with that. But until all that's together, that's when we'll order our torque converter and go from there. But thanks for watching this time. Hopefully it was a little bit informative. I know not a lot of guys are showing how they bolt their Turbo 400s up to basically a bazillion different engines you can do now. I've seen them bolted behind 2JZs, all different Mopars, Fords. Doesn't matter. With these bell housings, you can they make a range for basically any engine. So, like, comment, subscribe. Remember, 10% of all earnings from this channel are going to charity for cancer awareness, basically donating to the Cancer Society, or Wounded Warriors Project. We'll kind of split it down the middle and give to each of those as we keep this rolling. And again, takes no obligation from you. Just a like, subscribe, comment. As I said, any tips you can give me as I kind of try to battle my way through this, let me know. And especially how we can get this to 800 horsepower. Because 781, I can't say I have 800 horsepower yet. So, see you next time.